r/nosleep. Posted by u/Carl1961. I tried to save the soul of a dying old man. I failed. I entered the hospital, stepping out of the heavily falling snow and gusting wind into the comfortably warm interior of the lobby. I brushed snow off of my dark overcoat as I strode determinedly down the lobby to the elevators, my face solemn, briefcase in hand. I entered an elevator and get off on the 7th floor. I walked to the nurse's station. A middle-aged nurse with a severe face looked up from her computer. Yes? I'm here to see Mr. Nelson in room 26. Her tone was officious. I'm afraid he can't see any visitors right now, his condition is critical and... I pulled open my overcoat enough for her to see the white clerical collar around my neck. Her face softened. So did her voice. Oh. I'm sorry, Father. Yes, of course, come with me. She got up and came around and guided me down a corridor. Did he request that you see him? She asked me. No. But I know he's dying and I thought he might want some spiritual support and guidance, I answer. I'm not so sure, Father. He refused to let the hospital chaplain see him. He had some rather colorful language for him. I have to at least give him a chance before he passes. She stopped outside room 26. He's in here. She lowers her voice. He probably won't make it through the night. I nodded and thanked her. She opened the door for me and I entered. I looked at the dying man on the hospital bed, hooked up to machines, an oxygen mask covering his face. I regarded him somberly. Robert Nelson, age 72, dying of pneumonia. His face was heavily lined, thin and ravaged by a lifetime of strife and hardship. His long gray hair was spread out over the pillow behind him. There was an old scar, several inches long, that notched his right temple, running down the side of his head. He was thin to the point of emaciation. His eyes were closed and he appeared to be sleeping. For several moments there was only the sound of his labored breathing and the slightly irregular beeping of the electrocardiogram. I removed my overcoat and placed it in the empty chair by the bed. I left my gloves on. I opened my briefcase and removed my purple stole, draping it around my shoulders, then picked up my Bible. I cleared my throat, then spoke softly. My son, I said, feeling a moment of absurdity, as I always do, saying the word, a man in his early 30s addressing a man old enough to be his grandfather as his son. The old dying man stirred and muttered in his sleep. My son, I repeated in a slightly louder voice. He stirred again and slowly opened his bleary, bloodshot eyes. They looked around without focus for a moment, then anchor upon me, a young, bearded man in a dark suit with a white collar and a stole. His eyes narrowed balefully when he realized what I was. I stared into his eyes and could see his entire life within them. A life of pain and cruelty, struggle and defeat. I could see everything. My son, I continued softly, time has grown short. Your hour is at hand. Do you wish to make confession and have me absolve you of your sins? His eyes bore upon me for a moment, then he struggled to find his voice. His words were muffled and incomprehensible due to the oxygen mask covering his lower face. He fumbled with it and pulled it down. His voice was a weak, liquid wheeze, his lungs were full of fluid. Go to hell. The 8-year-old boy watches with fearful wonder from under the kitchen table where he cowers. The man in the sweat-stained undershirt argues with the woman in the frayed and faded house dress. No, I wanna know. Who is he? Who you been fucking when I ain't around here? None of your fucking business. The woman shrieks at him. I fuck who I want whenever I want. Bitch. He slaps her brutally. She staggers back. He removes his belt from the loops of his tattered pants, doubles it over and raises it above his shoulder. I'll put you in your fucking place where you belong. He screams, swinging the belt at her wildly. Don't touch me. She screams and darts out of the dingy kitchen, the man behind her, brandishing the belt, yelling frenzied obscenities. The boy watches from his low vantage point as the man freezes in the doorway, lowering the belt and backing away from something in the other room, his eyes suddenly wide and alarmed. Put that down. Don't. A gunshot pierces the boy's ears, following by a shrill ringing sound. Blood explodes from the man's chest. He stumbles back and collapses to the grimy kitchen floor. The woman re-enters, aiming the smoking .38 revolver at the still, bloody figure on the floor before her. An involuntary whimper escapes from the boy's lips and the woman spins in his direction, her eyes locking on him and narrowing. She approaches him, face set in a vengeful scowl. This is all your fault, she hisses, raising the revolver, its dark bore seeming to fill his vision. He screams, a plea he never finishes. Mommy, don't. Another gunshot. A yellow flower blooms in his vision and suddenly he is lying on his side, the right side of his head burning and warm moisture trickling down his face. From his sideways perspective he sees the woman raise the .38 to her own temple. A final gunshot and she joins the man sprawled on the ground. He lies there in shock, thinking he is dead, ears ringing from the blasts and bleeding from the bullet that grooved his skull. He begins to gasp. He is alive. My son, I persisted, unperturbed, please. Death draws nearer. You can still be saved, but there isn't much time. God never saved me, my whole life. He gasps. The boy, 10 years old, lies shivering upon his small bed. His foster parents' home is poorly heated and his blankets are thin and threadbare. His stomach growls. He is hungry. They didn't feed him today. They were punishing him for missing a spot while mopping the kitchen floor. They punish him most days. Sometimes they'll toss him their scraps if he acts like a good dog and does tricks for their amusement. They make him eat them off the floor. He waits in bed with dreadful anticipation, knowing what is to come. He hears the creak of footsteps approaching outside his room. His door creaks open, then closes quietly. He can smell the whiskey on his foster father's breath. He hears him begin to fumble with his clothes. He closes his eyes tightly, resigned to what is about to happen. God's love is unwavering and his mercy is infinite. Bullshit. God had no love or mercy for me my entire life. The young soldiers trekked on through the jungle, through the mosquitoes and the sweltering thick air. They had been moving all day and it was now nearly sunset and time to set up camp soon. The young man is bringing up the rear, hunched forward under his 70 pounds of gear. He nudges back his helmet to wipe sweat off his brow, scratching distractedly at the scar on his right temple. Ahead of him is Rick, his only friend in the whole platoon. Rick has short curly red hair and freckled cheeks. He is from Detroit. He wants to own a used car dealership after he returns to the States. Rick is quietly singing California Dreamin' under his breath. He throws a look back at the young man. You still with us, Nelson? Barely, the young man pants. Shit, I hear you. All this fucking humping we're doing takes it out of you. Yeah, I'd rather be humping something else. They both chuckle. Hey, Bobby, if you could ball Raquel Welch or Jacqueline, what's her name, that British chick, who would you go for? Why not both at the same time? They laugh. The young man smiles quietly to himself. He has a girl back home. He takes her picture out of his shirt pocket and looks at it for the 1000th time. She says she'll wait for him. It happens fast and comes without warning. There is no premonition, no tense moment of uneasy silence. There is the sudden unmistakable staccato pattern of Soviet-manufactured machine guns firing from the jungle ahead of them. The air is full of the green streaks of tracer rounds like hellish darts. 4 men are instantly riddled and hit the ground spasming. Ambush. The young man hears the squad leader scream and the remaining men drop to the ground and return fire. He looks to his left and sees Rick, his face pressed to the ground, eyes wide with terror. For a moment their eyes meet. In front of him, 10 feet away, a young smart-assed Brooklynite named Watkins is writhing and screaming for his mother, his intestines spilling out of his ruptured abdomen and piling around him like sausages. Not far away from where Watkins is dying, a soft-spoken black kid from Alabama named Tyson is staring blankly at the blue sky above with his one remaining eye, he caught a round in the other. He fires crazily into the jungle until the M16 runs out. He is fumbling for a fresh magazine when he hears something that stops him cold, a sinister whistle from above, getting louder. Look out, Bob. He hears Rick scream a second before his friend crashes into him, knocking him clear a split second before the incoming mortar obliterates him. An explosion of earth, grass and shredded bits of flesh and bone. He lies dazed for a moment, ears ringing from the blast, then glances over to where Rick had been. There is nothing there but a smoking crater. Fragments of his friend's charred uniform rain down from the sky, followed by his twisted, blackened helmet. He screams Rick's name but can't hear his own voice over the ringing in his ears. So like that long ago day in his parents' kitchen, the Lord works in mysterious ways, I counter. Not you nor any man can presume to understand his will. My whole life, he never showed me anything but pain. A certain amount of suffering is to be expected in this life. Suffering and pain enlighten and humble us so that we can better understand Christ's love and his sacrifice. He died for nothing. We all do. The taxi cab pulls away as he steps off the sidewalk onto the walkway leading up to her house. He is smiling, but his eyes are still haunted by his memories of the jungle. And of Rick. He had taken a taxi here straight from the airport and is still in his uniform. He pauses outside her door and takes out the small jewelry box that contains the ring he bought from a pawn shop on the way. He rings the bell and waits. The door opens and she stands there, even more beautiful than he remembered the last time he had seen her 2 years before. He waits for her face to fill with joy at the sight of him. He waits for her to return his smile. Instead, her face crumples into a snarl of rage and her eyes darken. Before he even sees her hand move, she has slapped him viciously. He is stunned. In the next instant, she has spit on him. "Get out of here, baby killer." Before his reeling mind has even begun to process any of it, the slap, the spit, the insult, she has slammed her door, the sound like the lid of a coffin slamming shut. He will never see her again. His cheek wet and stinging, his heart pierced, he shuffles back down the walkway to the sidewalk, his shoulders sagging. He tosses the wedding ring into her trash can before he leaves. That is not true. The love of God and His Son shine upon all men. But some men refuse to see it. You can shove God's love up your ass, preacher. "Please, my son," I said, my voice betraying the sense of urgency I feel. "Now is not the time for blasphemy or anger. This is the time for reconciliation. You must confess your sins and beg the Father Almighty for His forgiveness if you wish to feel His glory in the hereafter." Maybe he should beg my forgiveness. The middle-aged man stands before the foreman's desk in his small glass-walled office off the factory floor. He speaks with desperation. "Mike, you can't do this to me. This job is all I got." "It's not my decision, Bob. I've told you that already." "Mike, I've worked here almost 30 years. Another year and I can get my pension and retire. This isn't easy for any of us, Bob. You're not the only one getting hurt. 5,000 other guys are losing their jobs, too. The owner's shipping the company overseas. Cheap labor. Cutting costs. Maximizing profits. I don't agree with the greedy cocksucker, but that's how business works these days. Pleading now. Mike, I ain't qualified for anything else. I don't even have a high school diploma. I'll be out on the streets." "I'm sorry, Bob, really, I am. I always liked you. There's nothing I can do. If you don't atone, you will be lost," I warned him. "Do you realize that? You must repent and make an act of contrition if you wish to be redeemed." I looked at him in desperation. There wasn't much time left. He was fading before my eyes. He spoke with great effort, a force of will, and the gasps between his words were longer and heavier than before. "I'd rather be lost than spend eternity kissing his ass." The old man, ragged and unwashed, flails back and forth between them like a ragdoll, pummeled mercilessly by the 3 large teenaged boys in football jerseys laughing with malevolent glee. "Why don't you get a fucking job, you worthless piece of shit?" One jeers before smashing his fist in the old man's already bleeding mouth. "People like you are the scum of the earth." A second one chimes in, driving his fist into the old man's stomach. "You think you can leech off decent working people, people who actually contribute to society, like a fucking parasite, for a living, old man? You make me fucking sick." The third sneers before hitting him from behind in the kidneys. "You should be exterminated." The first one screams and kicks him in the crotch. The old man collapses to the trash-littered pavement, gasping and writhing, beaten and bloody. The 3 boys, laughing and whooping, hop back into their expensive sports car and speed off, leaving him there. Gradually the agony abates somewhat and eventually he painfully pulls himself to his feet. His tin can is crushed and empty, like Rick's helmet. He thinks fleetingly, they had robbed him of the scant amount he had earned that day panhandling. He spits out blood, then begins to cough raggedly. The coughing has been getting worse for days. He has some idea what it means. He can sense his time is coming soon. He looked at me a final time. He was very pale and his eyes were glassy. He was at the moment of extremis. He smiled for the first time, defiantly. His last words escaped on the outrush of his final breath. "Fuck, God." His eyes closed and he went limp. There was the shrill, steady tone of the electrocardiogram as he flatlined. He was gone. I heard the nurse running down the corridor toward the room. I lowered my head. I had failed. Falling and falling, drifting down into the black depths of oblivion in a slow spiral. For the first time in his miserable existence he feels peace. And in the final second, before his consciousness dissipates and the cool, comforting blackness swallows everything forever and ever, he feels something else he has never experienced before. Joy. The nurse gently covered his face with the sheet. She noted the time on the wall clock. A moment of respectful silence, then she asked me, "Were you able to help him, Father?" I shook my head, speaking with genuine regret. No. His anger was too great. He could not be saved. "I'm sorry." "So am I." She left. I gave him the last rites even though I knew it was useless, then I too left. In the elevator again, back down to the ground floor, I removed my gloves, which I had worn the entire time, and stared thoughtfully at the palms of my hands. I stared at the faint, circular scars in the center of each. I try so hard to save so many. It is my duty here on earth. And so often my efforts are in vain. So many are blinded by their own egos, their pride, their vengeance and anger. They refuse to see the glory of my Father. They refuse to be redeemed. But still I try. As I will again and again, until my Holy Father calls me back home where I will sit at his side and rejoice in his splendor. Home. Where we shall both bask in the glory, the sweet screams and wails of the tortured multitudes more magnificent than the most beautiful music ever composed by the most gifted musician who ever existed in this mortal realm. I wish I could have saved that man's soul. My Father could have used another slave in his kingdom. But there will be plenty more who I can perhaps still reach. Plenty more who can still be saved. Smiling sadly, I exited the elevator, crossed the lobby, and stepped back outside into the windy, snowing dark.